Welcome back to New Day Northwest. Being disappointed because something didn't turn out the way you hoped or expected is a real bummer. But my next guest says disappointment can be powerful, even useful, as long as we engage with it head on. Her new book, Political Disappointment, is a unique look at how setbacks have been used to fuel activism throughout time. Welcome back to New Day, author Sara Marcus. It's so great to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
So I have to say, it's really interesting because disappointment is a fascinating topic. It's something we all feel, sometimes on a daily basis, because we're often, though, taught that culturally we shouldn't show it. Don't talk about it. Don't show it. Get past it. But you say disappointment is healthy, and as a matter of fact, it's necessary. Why?
There are so many reasons to feel disappointed when we look around the world right now. There are so many positive changes that seemed possible and haven't come about.
Right.
And to be disappointed by those not coming about changes can sometimes feel like an additional layer of failure. We're doing it wrong. We're not marshaling the proper amount of hope.
Right.
The fact is, though, that disappointment, as long as if we're experiencing disappointment, it actually means that our desires for these futures that haven't come about, these desires are still alive. And that means they're still powerful, but only if, as you say, only if we engage with it head on, only if we're not afraid to look it in the face. And so in my book, I talk about how people have done just that, have engaged with their disappointments, and in so doing created some of the most important and enduring works of art and literature and music of the 20th century.
And you know, being disappointed means we care. We truly care about something. And your book shows examples throughout the last century of how disappointment inspired progress in a couple of different huge moments in time. Well, let's start with the Reconstruction era, right after the Civil War. How was that the case, where disappointment inspired change?
Absolutely. So Reconstruction is this effort to remake the United States as a truly multiracial democracy in the wake of the Civil War, right? But then Reconstruction ends, unfortunately, without actually bringing about that outcome.
Yeah.
And so things got worse at that point, especially for African Americans in this country. And the question is, what do you make of that? How do you react when history isn't getting better as it moves forward the way that you thought it would?
Right.
So it's this question that the Black intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois is dealing with when he sets out to write The Souls of Black Folk, which is one of the classics of American literature, comes out in 1903. What I love about this book is that at the center he chooses to place what he calls the sorrow songs, what we would know as spirituals, songs that African Americans produced and created and sang during slavery. These songs were controversial at the time. A lot of Black people felt that they were relics of a very unpleasant past that were better left in the past and not kept alive. But Du Bois felt that what we create in moments of difficulty, in really tough historical moments, can actually be very useful to forward motion. So he structured his whole book around them.
You also mentioned the feminist movement.
That's right. In the 1980s, when second wave feminism started to come up against some really serious backlash, and a lot of the achievements of the 70s were being chipped away at or rolled back, it was actually only by engaging with and dealing with what it felt like to understand that this disappointment was happening, that in this moment, white feminists and feminists of color came to a better understanding of themselves as being engaged in a common intellectual project, even that was marked by disagreement, but that disagreement didn't mean they weren't working on the same thing.
And you say that disappointment often leads to finding common ground, right?
That's right, because losing things, not getting what you want, these are essential components of what it is to be a human being. And not just because there are things that we all deal with, but in fact, how we respond to loss is how we make ourselves up as people. It's what our identities are based on. And so it's something that we all share, and if we can actually acknowledge and be in touch with it, it can be grounds for solidarity and coalition and community.
We only have about a minute left. I didn't get to ask you about the AIDS crisis and how disappointment shaped that, but can you talk about that briefly and other ways that disappointment can be a good thing?
The AIDS activist movement of the 80s and 90s was an incredible success, and it was built on people who were from very different backgrounds working together in an extremely diverse coalition. And that coalition was actually based on a shared understanding of the disappointment that the AIDS crisis had happened at all, and the way, gay liberation at this point was decades old.
Right.
It should have been able to prevent such a crisis from coming up in the first place.
Right.
And understanding that disappointment and harnessing that anger was what enabled the AIDS activist movement to have the successes that it had.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about this. So much to learn and to know and to discover in your book, Political Disappointment. And by the way, if you'd like to hear more from Sara, she has a book event tonight, June 22nd, at Elliott Bay Book Company. So head on down there and listen to that.